Climate change affects lives, livelihoods, and places. But does it actually cause mass migration? In this short video, I'll explain the links between climate change and migration, and then clear up some common misconceptions around the relationship between the two. Hi, my name is Melissa Siegel. I'm a professor of migration studies, and this is a channel about all things migration. So let's get right into the relationship between migration and climate or climate change. So human mobility linked to environmental drivers is definitely something that is not new, but global climate change is triggering more internal and in some cases international migration and displacement. Now, according to the Migration Policy Institute Climate Migration 101 Explainer, they explain that sometimes the impacts of climate change are fairly direct. For instance, more than 1 million Somalis were displaced by drought in 2022, but that was primarily within Somalia. But other times, impacts are more indirect, as it can be hard to trace how rising global temperatures threatens jobs and livelihoods and compels migration more indirectly. So in rural Honduras and Guatemala, for instance, these impacts have combined and amplified other drivers to prompt people to move to cities, the United States, and other destinations, right? So when we think about climate change and climate-related events, you can have things that are, quick onset disasters, but you can also have slow onset changes in the environment that can lead to then things like environmental degradation or lowering crop yields, which can then in turn make people at least aspire or want to migrate. It does not necessarily mean that they will actually be able to migrate. So if you have seen a number of my other videos on this channel, remember that migration is a combination both of aspirations to migrate, but also abilities to migrate. And it is only when those two things intersect that we'll actually see migration happen. Now, let's get into a few definitions because things can be a little bit tricky in this area. All right, so first of all, like you hopefully have seen in other videos on my channel, what is a migrant? A migrant is a person who is moving or has moved across an international border or within a state away from his or her habitual place of residence, regardless of that person's legal status, whether the movement was voluntary or involuntary, what the causes of that movement are, and what the length of stay is. All right, so in this case, when we're talking about the link between migration and climate change, we are definitely talking about both internal migration and international migration. As you will see, internal migration is actually much more important than international migration in this context. Now, another important term in this context is internally displaced persons. I also have a video on my channel about what internally displaced persons are, and that gives some more explanation of people who are displaced because of climate. But just for right now, let's do a quick recap. So IDPs are persons or group of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized border, right? So in this case, people have been forced to migrate, but they've stayed within the country's boundaries, all right? And this is going to be quite relevant in the case of climate change. Now, I also just want to remind us of what the definition of a refugee is, because sometimes the term refugee is used in the context of climate change, but there is actually an international convention, the 1951 Refugee Convention and 1967 protocols at the UN level that actually govern what the official legal definition of a refugee is. And that is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Notice there is nowhere in that definition or that UN definition that says anything about the environment or climate change. So this is where it can get a little bit tricky, particularly when sometimes people, well, in the media or policymakers like to use the term refugee in relation to climate change, which can be problematic in some regards. So I do actually have another video on my channel that is talking about whether or not we should use the term climate refugee and what the pros and cons are to that. So you can have a look at that video. Also, I'll make sure to link it in the description below. Now, climate change. What is climate change? So, a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. So, basically, I want you to be clear about what climate change is, because not all environmental factors that might lead to migration are because of climate change. And this is again where things can get a little bit tricky. So let's look at a few other definitions, all right? So environmental migration. So this just refers to the movement of a person or groups of people who predominantly for reasons of sudden or progressive changes in the environment that adversely affect their lives or living conditions are forced to leave their place of habitual residence or choose to do so either temporarily or permanently and move within or outside their country of origin or habitual residence, okay? So this is just about changes in the environment. If we then look at what climate migration is, then this migration is directly attributed to climate change, not just other possible environmental factors that are generally man-made also, I should say. But this is where it can get a little bit tricky. Sometimes it can be very hard to attribute a specific disaster or specific movement to climate change specifically, not just to an environmental change or an environmental disaster. So some of the terms that can also be a little bit more helpful in this regard are environmental migrants or environmentally displaced people, because it can be sometimes tricky to link people's displacement or their migration directly to climate change. So I just want you to be aware of these different definitions and these different concepts and what can be tricky about each of them. Now, how does climate influence mobility? There can be a number of different ways in which this can happen. So I'm just going to give you a few of the main pathways through which this happens. So one can be through sudden shocks that cause displacement. So these could be like environmental disasters, things like hurricanes or floods or wildfires. So the migration that comes from these kinds of disasters is often short-term and internal to that same country. There may be some cross-border migration, but this is much less and it is generally temporary. Then we have also slow onset stresses, things like desertification or sea level rise that degrade livelihoods and can increase migration pressure over the years. Now, the effect that this can actually have, though, can go in two directions. So the worsening conditions in an area can definitely increase the aspirations to migrate, but sometimes it can actually reduce the capabilities to migrate at the same time, because it's often affecting people's livelihoods, and it does take resources to be able to migrate, and we generally see that the poorest of the poor are not able to migrate. So again, while aspirations might increase, the capability to migrate might actually decrease. Then we have also more indirect effects. So climate interacts with economics, politics, and conflict. Crop failures can worsen poverty, which can shape migration decisions. Then we also have what is called adaptive mobility. So migration can be a strategy people use to diversify income and to adapt to changing conditions. So basically, you can see people using migration as a kind of risk mitigation strategy in the context of climate change. So it's not that they're just migrating because of a disaster, it is that they want to kind of spread the risks over more parts of their families, for example, to have incomes from additional sources, since maybe particularly families that are reliant on agricultural yields might be more affected by climate change. Now, whether climate and climate change actually leads to migration depends on a number of different factors. It depends on wealth, social networks, governance, access to adaptation mechanisms, land rights, and migration policies. So better off households may move long distances, while poorer households often cannot afford to move at all. So within the context of migration and climate change, we also have an important group that is what we call involuntarily immobile. So these are people who would like to move, but for one reason or another are not able to move. So this might be, physical barriers. It also might be because of lack of access to visas or regular pathways to migration, but it also might be because they just do not have the financial resources or the networks to be able to migrate. All right, so all of these things are very important. Now, there are a number of myths and misconceptions around migration and climate change, and I just want to go into a few of them here. So one of the typical myths around migration and climate change is that climate change is going to lead to a kind of mass exodus of people over the next decade, flooding across borders, and that there will be some kind of mass international migration because of climate change. That is just not true. At least in the short to medium term, we know that will not be the case. So the majority of migration, because of climate-related factors, is actually internal and short distance. So climate change is real and it is affecting people's lives, but they are much more likely to migrate internally than they are to migrate internationally. Additionally, much of that displacement that we see, especially because of disasters, is short term. So within 6 months or a year, people are actually able to go back to the place where they previously lived. In some cases, people purposefully live in areas that are very subject to the effects of climate change, or they live in floodplains. And that is often because the soil is more fertile in those areas, and they have just had to find adaptation strategies to deal with the flooding or the effects of climate change. So what is also really important to know and to recognize is that the majority of the people around the world actually have a preference for staying. If you've seen some of my other videos, it's only around 3.5% of the world population that is actually an international migrant. The majority of the world, the majority of populations actually want to stay in place. They want to stay in their local communities. They want to stay in their ancestral places of origin, and many people have strong ties to the land. So what they want to do first is to try to find other adaptation mechanisms to still be able to stay in their places of origin. Now, that doesn't mean that perhaps they might send one family member abroad to maybe try to work and send resources back, but what it does mean is that people have a preference for staying. Interestingly enough, back in 2017, New Zealand proposed the idea of a climate refugee or climate-related humanitarian visa specifically aimed at Pacific Islanders, who we know are being heavily affected by the effects of climate change and will also be in the future. But this plan was actually shelved due to pushback from the Pacific Islanders themselves, who wanted emphasis on preemptive solutions that allowed them to stay in their homes where possible. They weren't interested in just uprooting their entire lives and their entire families to move to New Zealand. They wanted to try to find ways so that they could adapt and stay in place. And I think that is very important to realize and to recognize. So another typical myth around migration and climate change is that climate is the sole reason for migration, when in reality, climate is just one factor among many that feed into people's decision on whether or not to migrate. Things like economics, social ties, and politics often matter much more than climate change as such. Another myth around migration and climate change is that climate migrants are all forced and vulnerable. All right, in reality, migration can be adaptive and empowering if supported, and some choose to move for opportunity and not only survival. What we also see is that, of course, the link between having resources and migrating because of climate change is not so straightforward. So people that have more resources can often employ more strategies to not have to move. So for example, building storm surge walls or making a more fire-resistant home, for example. But on the other hand, having more resources often leads to more capabilities to migrate. So it's not really straightforward as to whether or not the wealthy, for instance, will migrate more or less. So it's much more complex than perhaps we see at face value. I would say also another maybe common misconception is that moving solves climate variability. So in reality, migration can reduce risk for some, but can also create new vulnerabilities where perhaps people don't have the same rights or services or access to decent work. So again, the relationship here is not directly straightforward. So I think in sum, what is really important to recognize is that climate change will not lead to mass migration in the foreseeable future, at least not mass international migration. So climate change is real, but it will not lead to mass international migration. People often purposely stay in areas that are more vulnerable to climate change. There are a number of other things that also can explain this. I would definitely urge you to have a look at Hein de Haas's book, How Migration Really Works, and look at his chapter specifically on myths around migration and climate change to get more of a deep dive in this area. Now, of course, we should be thinking about the policy implications of migration and climate change. It is true that perhaps for some people in certain areas, maybe in small island states, international migration might become a necessity. And that does mean that we do need to probably have some open visa categories for this type of humanitarian migration. It is just important to recognize that this is not going to be huge, large numbers of people, because the number of people that are inhabiting small island states is not that large. Effective responses in general around this combine investment in local adaptation strategies and livelihoods, support safe and legal mobility and labor pathways, because oftentimes people might just want to migrate to be able to earn a living, but don't want to migrate permanently. We need to protect displaced people's rights and plan participatory, context-specific relocations where this is needed, and improve data to link climate and migration policy. Of course, we know that data is always important, or should be important, to evidence-based policymaking. Now, climate change and migration are linked, but maybe not in the ways that you originally thought. The relationship is complex, it's mediated, and often misrepresented. So policies in this area should focus on people's needs and choices, not alarmist headlines. All right. So if you found this video helpful and useful, there are some other videos on the channel linking migration and climate change. Of course, I already told you about one of the videos on whether or not you should actually use the term climate refugee, but there are also other videos on the channel that look specifically at how refugees and refugee camps are exposed to extreme weather events, and a chat with Professor Hein de Haas on the links between migration and climate change. So if you're interested, definitely make sure to check that out. If you found the video useful, of course, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the videos that we upload on a regular basis on this channel. And I do hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.